Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IPM Day webinar series. My name is Renee Adair. I'm a volunteer with IPM Day. Today's program is Project Manager's Guide to ITIL. We thank you for your participation. Remember, IPM Day is November 7th. Make sure you are beginning to plan your events. Our speaker today is Erica Flora. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function, and we will try to address your questions at the end of the session if we have time. I'd like to now turn it over to Erica Flora to provide her presentation. Thank you, Erica.
Great. Well, welcome, everyone. So the first few slides just give an introduction to International Project Management Day and PDU Information. We will make these slides available following the webinar as well as the recording of this session, so you'll have all this information available. I do want to jump right in and talk about a Project Manager's Guide to ITIL. So today we're going to talk about some ITIL basics, but from a project management slant. For those of you that don't know who I am, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, a little bit about my company, what we do, and then we're going to jump right into ITIL, what it is, what the acronym means, why you should care about it as a project manager. Then once we talk about that, next we'll cover at a high level some of the similarities and differences between PMI's PMBOK guide and the ITIL framework. Once we talk about these two frameworks at a high level, we're going to walk through each of the project management process groups and show where ITIL intersects with the project lifecycle. So once I fill your head with all this good information, we're then going to talk about what you as a project manager can do to learn more. We'll also talk about the ITIL certification path, as it's a little bit different than the PMP certification path, and then we'll round out with some Q&A. So a little bit about me. My name is Erica Flora, and I'm a principal at Beyond 20. We do ITIL and project management training, assessments, consulting to help organizations figure out where to start. Specifically with ITIL, where to start, what you should start doing to improve, how to implement tools so that you actually get value out of them. Beyond 20 is a global REP as well. We're an accredited training organization through APMG, the certifying body for ITIL. About me personally, I've been a long-time project and program manager. I am PMP and CGMP certified. I'm also what's called ITIL expert certified. It's currently the highest that you can go in the certification path. And at the end of this webinar, we'll talk a little bit about what the different certifications are. But I've had the really good fortune to lead a bunch of IT service management projects. We'll talk through what that acronym means, what the ITIL acronym means. But I've also helped implement ITIL tools, help revamp existing tools, and help put good processes in place. I'm also a really firm believer in giving back to the project management community. I've served on the boards of a couple of PMI chapters, both in San Diego as well as Phoenix, and volunteered out in DC as well. So I'm a frequent PMIer, and I've spoken to a lot of different places and do a lot of training. Okay, so let's start out and talk about why ITIL. I'm sure some of you may have heard this buzzword, some of you may not. This may be the first time that you're hearing it. That's maybe why you're here. We're going to talk about it, why it's important to IT project managers, why it's important to have an understanding of what this acronym is. Okay, so first we need to understand what ITIL is. ITIL stands for the Information Technology Infrastructure Library. It's basically a set of books, kind of like the PMBOK, except you got 5 of them, that were developed in the 1980s out of the UK. And the way that it came to be, and bear with me because some of this is urban legend, so just kind of go with it, but the way that the story goes is that the CCTA, they're called the Central Computer and Telecommunications Agency, essentially the IT department for the British government. Each year they would talk about where they had spent their money the previous year, what they were needing in terms of budgeting going forward. And when they were asked what would sometimes seem like simple questions, but I think a lot of IT organizations struggle with these kinds of questions, they couldn't answer certain things like, what services do you provide the British government? What's the value of those services? How much are those services costing us? They could answer things like, how much does hardware cost? How much does software cost? How much are our resources costing us? But they couldn't say, we offer email, and this is how much it costs per user, and this is why it's important, how it's valuable to the British government. And so what they did is they said, we need to find out the answer to this. And so in good government fashion, they did a 7-year study to find out what best in class in IT was doing. And they surveyed something like 2,500 different organizations, both large and small, public, private, basically looked at everyone's lessons learned on what they were doing to be successful. And that was version 1 back in the 80s. It was a lot of material. It was 40 giant volumes of information. But what was kind of brilliant about it is because it was done by the British government, it became public knowledge, and people started looking at it if you could read through all the information. It had great things in it, like how do you manage change in IT? How do you do releases so that it doesn't disrupt your IT environment? And the British government looked at it and said, wow, we've actually got some great intellectual property here that we've collected. Why don't we turn this into a full certification path and try to make some money off of it? So in 2001, they did a refresh of the books. So they went down from 40 books all the way to 7, took out a lot of the redundancies, took out the stuff that was technology specific that was no longer relevant, and ended up with 7 books. In 2007, they did another refresh, kind of like how PMI refreshes the PMBOK, and came out with version 3, essentially. So version 3 has been in place since 2007. That's the current version, so kind of like the new version of the PMBOK that has just come out. They do the same refresh through volunteers looking at the different books and rewriting them and making sure that they're relevant and they're useful. But version 3 has 5 books, and these are the books that are pictured here. What's important about the books, when you hear ITIL, it's really just saying the PMBOK. It's like saying the encyclopedia. What's important about the ITIL books is the focus of those books, and that's what's called IT Service Management, or if you hear the acronym ITSM, that's what the subject of the books are. It's kind of like saying the PMBOK, within the PMBOK is project management best practice. Same idea here. What you're learning in the ITIL books is how to be a good service provider, and thinking of yourselves as an IT provider, not so much as a provider of technology, but a provider of services that are going to be valuable to your customers. What's interesting and relevant to us as project managers was that the version 3 refresh that came out in 2007 went beyond just focusing on processes. Version 2 was a lot more specific to folks that worked in like ongoing operations, IT operations. Version 3, the current version, has a lot more overlap, and it's complementary to what's in the PMI PMBOK guide. One other thing that I want to mention is that the difference between ITIL and ITSM. ITIL, again, is the books. The subject is what's called IT Service Management, and it's this concept of becoming a true service provider, providing services that are going to be valuable to our customers, and it gives IT a way to align with what the business wants, and to start to think more as a strategic partner, as more as a consultative and trusted partner with the business rather than providers of technology. It's almost like thinking of IT as any other service provider does, as hotels do, as the airline industry does, as restaurants do. You're not just providing, if you think about a restaurant, you're not just providing food. You're serving the food. You're providing value so that folks don't have to cook their own dinner, that they don't have to worry about any of that kind of thing. It's the same concept just applied to IT. It's almost like thinking about IT as a business within a business, and making sure that what we provide in IT really meets up with what our customers want. Okay, so let's talk about ITIL in the marketplace a little bit. Some of you may have heard the acronym ITIL, some of you may not. TechTarget did a study, and actually right behind PMP and CAPM, they found that ITIL Foundations ranks pretty high in terms of salary. Even in a down economy, the ITIL certifications are highly sought after certifications. They're a great certification to have. I think it's a fantastic complement to PMP. Plus, if you take an ITIL Foundations class, you get 24 PDUs, so it also helps you get, maintain your PMP certification. Gartner actually did a couple of different surveys, and they found that actually, and this is a couple of years old now, so I'm sure that this number is higher, a lot higher than 50%. But they found that when they looked at big organizations, the Fortune 500 companies, that half of them are doing something with ITIL. They may not be calling it ITIL, but they're implementing best practice in terms of IT process, and it aligns with what the ITIL concepts say. So they're using ITIL. So if you haven't heard of this acronym before, I promise you will hear about it more often going forward. And in fact, when they surveyed CIOs, 85% of them said that, yeah, ITIL is on my roadmap for the next 24 months. We're going to be looking at it, in maybe small scale, large scale, but using it and looking at it in some fashion. So why the interest? I think because organizations have found that you can't spend your way out of problems. And in fact, Gartner Research, when they did a study of mission-critical systems, and when they went down, they did root cause analysis to look at, okay, why did this go down? Actually, only 20% of the time was it due to failure in people, failure in process, or excuse me, I have that backwards. Only 20% of the time was it due to hardware failure, software failure, natural disaster. Actually, 80% of the time it was due to failure in people or process. Somebody made a change and they didn't think about the impact. They skipped a step. They didn't know what the process was. And what IT organizations are starting to find is that you can't just buy more hardware. You can't buy more software. You can't throw more people at the issue. And a lot of times IT budgets are shrinking. They're finding that you have to do more with what you have. You have to get better at how your folks are working. You have to bring standardization and governance and best practice into what you're doing to become more efficient, to become a service provider that provides higher quality services, makes better use with the money that you have. And in fact, there was a study done by AMR Research where they looked at IT organizations that had implemented ITIL good practice, and actually some of them had saved up to 10% in costs without having to sacrifice anything in terms of quality, customer satisfaction, anything like that. So this is really where ITIL helps, is looking at our processes, figuring out how people can work smarter rather than work harder. Okay, so there's lots of similarities between PMI's PMBOK guide and the ITIL books. Let's start out by going through these at a high level, and then we're going to dig into some practical takeaways. All right, so at a high level, if we look on the left-hand side, on the PMBOK side, we have one book. It's a 300-page or so reference book that serves as the basis for the PMP exam. If you look over to the right, on the ITIL side, version 3, there's actually 5 books. They're about the same size as a PMBOK. Actually, some of them are a little bit larger. And there's one for each of what's called the 5 phases of the service lifecycle, and we'll talk more about that later. On the PMBOK side, the PMBOK provides good practice for project management. On the ITIL side, the ITIL books provide good practice for what's called IT service management, so providing services to better services to our customers. On the PMBOK side, we have 5 process groups, kind of similar to how ITIL breaks it up into service lifecycle phases, and they both have a lot of processes. On the PMBOK side, 42 processes. I think that might change a little bit in this new PMBOK edition. ITIL version 3, it depends on what you consider to be a major process versus a minor process, but there's about 25 or so processes. Both have lots of processes, and there is some overlap between the two. They're both very focused on process, and I think this is what makes it really approachable. What makes ITIL approachable to a project manager is that it's not about technology. You don't have to have worked in IT. You don't have to have a degree in MIS or anything like that. It's all about process. It's all about how do we manage change? How do we manage things when they break? How do we deliver things that customers are asking for us. And so if you're in that kind of PMBOK mindset and you understand process, you're going to get and understand what ITIL is talking about. So let's talk about how they're similar. They're both frameworks, and they're similar in their mission. It's really to provide something that the customer wants, to solve a problem. You know, in the case of projects, it's to solve a problem, provide something new. IT service management, same idea here. It's to solve a challenge that you're having in IT or to provide something new for customers, new or different for customers. They both strive to raise the level of the profession. You know, when I got into project management, people would say, oh, well, you're assigned the role of a project manager, so go forth and manage your project. And there wasn't any sense of, yeah, there's actually a career here, and there's tools, and there's a method to it, that this is actually, you know, profession. And IT has kind of been the same way. You know, you kind of picture IT people doing their own thing, kind of, you know, being very reactionary. And what ITIL helps to do is create more of a certification around the profession and raise the level of professionalism within IT. They're both scalable frameworks. They're both what's called descriptive, not prescriptive, so they don't say you have to do everything. You know, you have to create all of this documentation. You have to, you know, walk through each of these steps. It says, here's all the tools that you can use, but tailor it to the needs of your organization. And in project management, you know, it's tailored to the needs of your project. You don't necessarily have to do everything, and you can scale your documents, you can scale your processes so that they're practical and they work well for you. They both have their own language. They both have their own terminology. They're both accepted as the worldwide standard for their domain, whether it be project management or service management. They're both regularly reviewed by industry experts, and you know, the PMBOK and the ITIL books are both refreshed every few years. Again, they both focus on process, so not so much technology. Just like on the project management side, you don't have to be a whiz in Microsoft Project or Primavera to get through the exam. You just have to understand good process and how to handle situations. Same thing here. It's about, do you understand the processes rather than, you know, having to know specific technology. They also both have certification paths. They both have professional organizations. So PMI on the project management side, and then there's a group called ITSMS on the ITIL side. And they also serve as a really good complement, because when you go to implement ITIL concepts, you really need to have good project management skills. And if you're a project manager working in IT, you really need to be able to understand the language that you're working in. And a lot of these terms are things that in IT organizations they're doing and they're using. Okay, so let's start out with the project management lifecycle, talk through that at a very high level, because we're going to use this as, what do we call it, the framework when we compare against the ITIL processes and the ITIL lifecycle. So PMBOK has 5 process groups that you move through as you go through a project from start to finish. We're not going to go into too much detail. I just want to show how ITIL compares, and this will be the structure that we use to show the intersection. So you start out with initiating the project, defining, you know, things like defining the new project, determining your stakeholders, then you're planning the project, determining your scope, your objectives, what your plan of action is going to be. Then you're actually executing or doing the work to meet that specification. You're monitoring and controlling, you're tracking the project, reviewing work, putting corrective action into place to ensure that you're aligned with your goals, and then you're closing it out. You're doing a formal closeout and transfer, at the end of each phase or at the end of that project. It's very iterative in nature. You're doing a lot of replanning, re-executing, monitoring, controlling, and it's cyclical. So as we move into the IT service management lifecycle, it's also cyclical. It's also broken down into what they call 5 phases or stages. But the difference here is you're looking at an IT service, let's say email, from cradle to grave of that service. It starts with, in the middle, service strategy by determining what services are we going to offer to our customers, and are we offering the right services? Who are our customers? Do we have a good handle on who they are, what they want, what they care about? And it's about asking the why behind offering a service when we get a new request in or we get a request to change a service before we ever get into the how. And I think sometimes we rush so much into the how that we don't ever take a step back and say, customer, what is it that you're trying to do, so that what we create for you, the solution that we provide, actually lines up with what you want, not with what we think you need. So that's service strategy, and there's a number of processes there that you have to think about as you're coming up with justification and figuring out the why behind services. Once a service gets chartered, this is where we come in as a project manager. And if you look towards the bottom left, you're looking at service design. Service design is all about designing that blueprint for that new service. It's looking at who are the people, who are the what are the processes, the technologies, the suppliers, all the stuff that has to go into the design of that service so that it lines up with what we've defined in our strategy. As you move out of design, you go into a phase called service transition. So at the top of the slide, transition is all about taking that new or changed service from design into operation and making sure that we protect stuff in our live environment. So you've got processes like change management, making sure that we review our changes before we actually make them. Release management is in there as well as a few other processes. Once that service is transitioned into operation, this is typically where we get out of the way as a project team and as a project manager and hand it over to operations, and then they manage the day-to-day service. If you look around the outside, continual service improvement is that last phase in the series, and it's all around continually not only aligning with the needs of our customers and the business, but as those needs change, we're also looking for ways that we can change, how we can improve our services, our processes, making sure those improvements are implemented so that 5 years down the road, we're still providing services that are valuable, that customers are willing to pay for or willing to come to us for, and they're relevant to the times. So again, we as project managers work primarily in that phase called service design, service transition, and you'll see a lot of touch points as we go through in those two phases. So let's talk about where those touch points are. I'm going to warn you that this slide is a little busy at first, but we are going to walk through it, and I think it does a really good job of showing the interaction between project management and the ITIL framework. I always get questions as to how those two fit together, and this is the best picture that I've been able to find that shows the difference. So if you look at the very top, there's that first purple arrow. This is where the project team is involved. So typically when that service gets chartered, we're going to step in, and you'll see that the second set of purple arrows shows the phases of the service lifecycle. So we may be a little bit involved in strategy, but oftentimes we're not involved so much in approving the project. We get involved later on. So we're more involved in design, transition, and then that gets handed over at some point, and our operations team takes over. If you look at the very top, this is where we're collecting business requirements, but we also need to be capturing something called service level requirements. And so if you look kind of towards the bottom of that picture, this is where you see SLR, that stands for service level requirements. What that stands for, or what you're doing there, is you're defining what customers can expect from IT once that service goes live. So, if they report an issue to the service desk, how quickly are they going to respond? How quickly are issues going to be resolved? How available is that service going to be? Does it need to be 5 nines in terms of availability? But also because this information is going to form the basis of what's called service acceptance criteria. So if you look kind of right underneath that purple arrow where it says project team, that stands for service acceptance criteria. And this tells us what that passing score needs to look like to make sure that that service is ready for go live. So we're collecting a lot of different types of information throughout the project. If you look right below or right after that, that purple arrow that says design, there's something called a service design package that gets delivered to our transition team, our service operation team, that helps them understand this is how we need to do testing and validation, this is how we need to do the release. It has things like, this is how this service was designed, these are the constraints we're working under, that also gets passed to the operation team so they can better troubleshoot what's going on. They understand the design of that service. And it's kind of a document that is going to be passed from the project team to the folks that have to support it. If you look across the bottom, there's also some touch points around change management. This is going to ensure that the right information is communicated out, so not only within our team and across projects, but across services, across the IT organization, that we're capturing changes to services and that we protect the live environment, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So the first intersection point between project management and service management is going to be in the initiating process group. So when a service is chartered by IT, this becomes what we know as our project charter. It's also going to become part of what's called our IT service portfolio as well as the project portfolio. And there's some differences between those. So some of the things that need to be included in our project charter are things like total cost of ownership for that service. So we need to be thinking not only about cost of projects, but ongoing costs once it's in operation, because IT cares about those kinds of things after we've handed it over. We also need to be mindful of stakeholders. It goes just beyond the business and our project team members. In a service management environment, we have to think about our end users, our process owners. We said that there was about 25 different ITIL processes. We need to make sure that if our organization is practicing ITIL concepts, we're getting those process owners involved, people like our service desk, our service level manager, maybe our capacity manager, availability manager. There's folks that we don't necessarily think about unless you have an understanding of ITIL and who all the players are and the roles are that are involved. As we move into planning, we've determined our stakeholders, we've collected requirements from our stakeholder groups. What I find project teams are pretty good at are capturing utility requirements, what ITIL calls utility. Things like our functional requirements, our technical requirements, but we're not always good about capturing what's called warranty requirements. Things like how much capacity are we going to need over the long term? What does availability need to be? And have we architected, this solution correctly for our availability needs? Have we thought about continuity and disaster recovery? Ultimately, these kinds of things determine whether or not a customer finds value in this service. And so we need to be mindful of those things and make sure that we plan them when we're in design, because what happens if we don't do that, and they have to be bolted on later, and it becomes much more expensive over the long term. As we're developing our project plan, there are some additional things that, if you're aware of the ITIL concepts, you'll want to make sure that you include in that project management plan. Things like, how are we going to monitor this service over the long term? So there's a process called event management. How is knowledge going to be transferred to all of the different stakeholder groups, my service desk, the folks that have to support it, the folks that have to do troubleshooting? How are we going to integrate with a process called configuration management once it goes through transition? So those kinds of things need to go into that project management plan as well. So as we move into executing, a lot of the processes within what we know as executing are going to integrate or align with ITIL processes and service transition. So there's a process called transition planning and support. This is where we need to make sure that we coordinate all of our activities not only across projects but across service teams, because we're not just affecting our own project team. What we're going to be delivering has an effect on a lot of other teams as well, and we need to be mindful of that. The ITIL books also talk about some other things that we can do to make sure that we're ready for ongoing service operation. They have this concept of a service operation readiness assessment, piloting, and things like that. They're really good tools to make sure that that handover is smooth and that we're going to be successful over the long term. As we look at monitoring and controlling, there are some ITIL processes, one specifically called validation and testing, that make sure that we test for both those utility and those warranty requirements. What else? Oh, perform integrated change control. This is a project management process, but it's important if you're working in an ITIL environment to understand the difference between what we understand as a change control board and what ITIL calls a change advisory board. So change control board we use internally so that when there are changes to our project, we're trying to protect our scope, our schedule, our budget, things like that. But there are going to be touch points with what's called the IT Change Advisory Board. What their goal is they want to protect the live environment. So anytime we're making a change within our project that could affect live IT services or future IT services, we need to be mindful of that and make sure that those kinds of changes are risen or brought before the Change Advisory Board. So there's some touch points there. There's also some touch points with what's called configuration management. This is making sure that we have an understanding of all the moving parts that are within IT, and so we're going to have some touch points there, and we need to be mindful of configuration management on a larger scale. So as we move into closing, we want to make sure that in that process that we know as close project or phase that we're actually doing good knowledge transfer. There's an ITIL process called knowledge management that makes sure, or that speaks to actually transferring our knowledge of the folks that are on our team to the folks that have to support it. A lot of times we kind of throw something over the wall and hope that it sticks and say good luck, supporting that. But we need to be thinking about how can we actually get what's in our brains, the folks that actually were involved in the team, if they're not the same folks that have to support it, how do we make sure that we have a transfer of those brains so that the folks that have to support it know what's going on. They're empowered to answer questions, to troubleshoot, do things like that. So we want to make sure that we're capturing things like known errors, that we're creating knowledge-based articles, that we're making things available to the folks that are the recipients of what we throw over the wall. There's also in the ITIL book called Continual Service Improvement. We want to make sure that we're capturing user feedback, we're capturing lessons learned, providing early life support, maybe even having the team sit on the service desk and help field calls, sending out customer surveys after that service has been put in place, and we're nearing the closeout, or even after the closeout of our project, to make sure that that project has long-term success. Okay, so now that I've filled your head with lots of ITIL terminology and a couple of tidbits of how it interacts with the PMI process groups, let's talk about what you can do from here. There's a couple of things I would recommend. This is going to sound a little bit like heresy, but project management and being a good project manager is more than just being on time, under budget, within scope. Because our customers are not going to care if we're on time or under budget if that service isn't successful, if they can't use it, if it's not there when they need it. So we need to think bigger than ourselves. We want overall service success, not just project success, because we're part of the larger organization, and we need to be taking on more of a long-term holistic view. Another thing I would say is that as project managers, we need to incorporate operations early and often, not just at the end of handover. They're not going to be successful, and we're not setting them up for success if we're doing that. Another thing I would recommend is to learn the language of ITIL. Just like in project management, there's a whole series of acronyms and terms that are specific to what we do. Same thing with ITIL. So we need to understand what a service is versus a project. We need to understand how ITIL looks at change management and how they look at configuration management versus how we look at those two things. We also need to learn where what we do integrates with or affects service management concepts. ITIL doesn't just concern operations. It really has a lot of overlap in what we do, so it's important that we understand what those touch points are, how they integrate, and how what we do affects the longer term and the greater good. So let's talk about the certification path. It kind of works on credit. So if you think of it almost like getting a degree in IT service management, that's kind of how you have to think about this. So this is all the classes that you can take with an ITIL. There's actually a few more than I have here on the slide, but just to kind of keep it simple. Everyone starts at foundation, so that bottom gray box, that's where you start. It's a 3-day class. Once you take the class, you pass the exam at the end, you get 2 credits towards ITIL Expert. And to become ITIL Expert, you needed 22 credits total. Once you pass foundations, you have a multitude of intermediate classes that you can take. You can take one, you can take many. You don't necessarily have to take any. But there's 9 different classes that are listed here, and I'm happy to talk offline if you guys have questions and you want to dig into what the intermediate classes are, we can certainly do that. If you look at the Lifecycle classes on the left-hand side, there's one for each of the 5 books, so you could take a class just on strategy. Once you pass that exam, you get 3 credits, and then you just kind of go through your credits. Once you get up to 15 credits, you can take the capstone class called Managing Across the Lifecycle. Once you pass that exam, you automatically become ITIL Expert because you have the 22 credits that you need. Now, what's cool about the certification path is, number one, like the PMP, or unlike the PMP rather, you don't need continuing credits. So you don't need to rack up PDUs to keep your certification. You just become certified, and you're certified. The other thing that's pretty great about it is when you take foundations, you don't have to fill out any application. You don't need any prerequisites. It's helpful if you have some familiarity with IT, but it's not required. You can certainly take a foundation class if you don't have any idea about IT. The only prerequisite that you have beyond foundations is that you take foundations. So in order to take any of the intermediate classes, you have to have your foundation certification, and then in order to take the capstone, the MALC class at the top, you have to have 15 credits total added up. So these are our upcoming foundations classes. We do public classes kind of all over the U.S., East Coast. We also have West Coast classes. These are just the next 3 that I picked out. We've got Virginia in July. We've got New York also at the end of July, and we have a class in Washington, D.C. in August. We run them in the Washington, D.C. area probably every 2 to 3 weeks, and then all over every few months or so. The classes are 3 days. You get 24 PDUs, and we actually guarantee that you pass. So if you don't pass, then we pay for or eat the cost of any retakes. We also have e-learning, and we can also come on site as well if you're wanting to get, let's say, all of your PMO or a group of people in IT certified in ITIL. We can certainly do that as well. Okay, so here's all my contact information. I actually also have a blog where I write about project management and IT and other stuff that I find interesting and fun. There is an article, if you go on there, called ITIL, A Project Manager's Perspective. That's just, I think it's about a couple of pages. It's not very long. But it talks about some of my favorite things about ITIL, and it's slanted from the view of a project manager, what I find valuable and what I think is cool about it. I also have Twitter and LinkedIn, and I'm a bit of a social media junkie, so if you'd love to connect or follow, I welcome all invitations. So let's, with that, open it up to some questions.
Hey, Erica. This is Renee. We do have some questions in the queue. Thought I'd go ahead and share those with you. One is, can you put the PDU slide back up while we're
Absolutely.
asking questions? Some people didn't get all of that.
Well, give me a second. There we go.
There we go.
Okay. Okay.
There you go. Okay. And then we had a question, are all ITIL certifications the same? Some companies offer the training and the quick test. How do you pick the right company, or what is the importance in finding the right training provider?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would, number one, make sure that you go with someone that is what's called an ATO, an accredited training organization. That means that their material is kind of like being an REP on the PMI side. That's the equivalent. So instead of REP, you're looking for ATO. that tells you that their materials have been reviewed by APMG, that their instructors have the right qualifications. They actually need more qualifications than just having foundations under their belt. They actually go through quite an extensive certification to become certified. So I would, number one, look for that, look for ATO. The other thing I would recommend is look for a training company that doesn't just subcontract out people that are certified, that they actually have people that have worked implementing ITIL concepts. I have students that come to our classes and say, I went to this ITIL class and I asked them how you actually implement some of these concepts, and they said, well, that's outside of the scope of this class, let's not talk about that. And so what that tells me is they don't really know how this stuff works in real life. And what we really pride ourselves in is we try to get students through the exam. I mean, that's what you care about. You want the certification, but also that you leave with some understanding of how it actually works in real life and how you might actually implement some of this stuff in your organization. You know, so I would ask, are these contractors? Are they full-time employees? Have they worked in the industry? You know, ask for a bio of who's going to be your instructor. You know, look them up online, see what they're writing, publishing, talking about. You know, if they really do this, or it's just something that they kind of do on the side, or you know, have just become certified.
Okay, thank you. The next one here, and Erica, you just let me know when you know, if you need to go or anything. I'll just kind of keep asking as we have them here.
Okay.
I normally deal with ICT, which stands for Information and Communication Technology, infrastructure preparation projects as baseline, lasting 3 to 5 years, followed up with long-term operation and maintenance services lasting totally for up to 35 years, life cycle. Is there any model combining in a single framework this kind of approach? If you need me to read it again, I will. How long?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So ITIL doesn't try to be all things to all people. It's very specific in what it does in terms of give good ideas on how to be a service provider and service management. But it does complement very nicely all of these other frameworks, methodologies, standards that are out there. So I've actually helped put metrics in place using ITIL concepts along with Six Sigma. You can use it, and it complements very well SDLC, Agile. In fact, if you go to the website, it's called ITIL-official site. There's a lot of other publications that the British government puts out that talks about ITIL and these other standards, methods, frameworks. I don't know about how it integrates specifically with those ones that you're talking about, but if you send me an email, I'm happy to do a little digging and see if anything like that exists.
All right, thank you. The next question is, the framework of PMI is different than the ITIL framework. How can we compare it?
It's different in terms of the approach. So project management really tells you what's the best way, or what are some good ways to manage a project. ITIL really tells you how do you manage services. So you may have multiple projects that make up a service. You may have multiple services that make up a project. So it depends on your approach. If you're trying to manage a project to scope, schedule, cost, PMBOK is the way to go. If you're trying to create services that your customers actually need and want from you as an IT organization, then you're going to want to pull concepts from ITIL. But any organization is going to pick and choose the stuff that works for them. And so you're not necessarily, when you come up with your methodology as an organization, you're going to say, okay, what from the PMBOK works for us, and what from ITIL works from us, or works for us, and Six Sigma and CMMI and COVID and all the other acronyms that are out there. You're going to kind of cobble together your own methodology that works for your organization.
All right. Is there any example you can mention of ITIL adoption in aerospace, maybe in combination with other PM standards?
Good question. Off the top of my head, I would imagine most of the large aerospace organizations are using ITIL. Some of our larger customers are all government contractors. So one of the things with ITIL is the U.S. government as well as the British government have really taken to ITIL. And if you look at any RFPs that are coming out from the U.S. government, they all say, you know, if it's a technology RFP that's put out there, it'll say, we want to see your compliance with ITIL. So I imagine every aerospace company is doing something with ITIL. I don't know of any case studies offhand, but I'm happy to send that information as well if you shoot me an email.
Okay, and I had a few questions about where the slides and audio will be posted. We will, in the next day or two, you should see them up on the International Project Management Day website. So we will get those posted there for you. Let's see. On a project, does Erica use a blended model of techniques, PMP, ITIL, Agile, Six Sigma, to achieve project success?
Yeah, I think you have to in today's environment, because there's pieces from each of these frameworks and standards and methodologies that are really helpful. So yeah, I always use ITIL concepts when I'm managing a project. I use project management concepts whenever I look at ITIL, you know, because if you want to implement, let's say, a good change management process in your organization, you have to treat it like a project. You've got to manage it to scope, schedule, budget, if that's going to be successful. So absolutely, I use a lot of different concepts as I'm managing projects. Absolutely.
All right, thank you. What is the relationship between ITIL and Prince 2?
Oh, good question. So Prince 2 is the methodology that has come out of the UK. So it's kind of the UK's version of project management. Prince 2 is actually also a really good complement to PMI's PMBOK, and I do webinars every few months on the difference between the PMBOK and Prince 2, so I'm happy to do that one for IPM, or you can check out our website as well. We list all of our upcoming webinars. But they integrate really well, and in fact, the UK has a book specific to integration of Prince 2 and ITIL. It's more of just a boiled down essence of what's important in project management, but it complements this other two very, very well.
Okay. What comes before ITIL or after the ITIL certification?
So before ITIL, nothing. After ITIL Foundations, you can take a multitude of advanced classes in ITIL, and I'm happy to talk with you at length about what those additional classes might look like and what could be right for you.
Okay, and I guess Erica, you could probably go ahead and pop up your contact slide again while we're.
Oh, sure.
Because you've mentioned a couple of times sending you an email. I just want to make sure people, have your contact information.
Sure, sure. Let me get to it.
There was a question, may a service be considered a stretched project?
They're different. So it depends. If, let's say, your project is you're rolling out an application is just part of an overarching service. So it may be an application for payroll, but that service could be a lot larger than that project. It could be potentially smaller. You could have multiple services contained within a project, but they are different things. It just depends on the project, really, and the scope of it.
There was a question about if we can use ITIL instead of PMP in a project.
You really can't use ITIL instead of PMP. PMP or the PMBOK really is the de facto for how to manage a project. So they don't replace one another, but they do complement one another.
Okay, here's a good question. Does a blended approach cause problems for other team members that lack certification?
No, I think as long as you educate folks, I mean, that's really what it comes down to, and say this is why we're doing this, and this is how it relates, and this is why it's important. People get that. Getting all of your people, with that said, getting all of your people certified so that they understand the words is really important. So just like with the PMP, I mean, getting a PMP doesn't tell me that someone's a good project manager. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But what it does tell me is when I use project management words, they know what I'm talking about. So if I say WBS, they know it's a work breakdown structure. They know the purpose of it. They know what it means. Same with ITIL. If I say, emergency change or standard change or normal change or incident or problem, I start using some of those words, somebody that is foundation certified is going to be following what I'm talking about, and it creates a lot less confusion. So even though certification isn't required, it's really, really helpful to an organization. Just get people moving in the same direction.
Okay, great. Let me just, do you have time for one more?
One more, yeah, that sounds great.
Oh, all right. For those with ITIL version 2 or earlier versions, where can I find the changes that version 3 includes?
Oh, good question. I think I have an article on my blog that talks about the changes. Very at a high level, the difference is in version 2 there were 11 processes, and then they also talked about this team called the service desk. In version 3, they've more than doubled the processes. So they didn't change anything in version 2. They just added a lot more to it. I'm happy to send, I have a slide that compares what was in version 2 versus what's in version 3. If you want to get certified, you have to start at the beginning again, unfortunately, and take a version 3 class. But it's a really good refresher, and there's a lot of great things that they've added to the ITIL framework.
All right. Well, really appreciate your time, Eric. I think this was a great presentation. There were a few probably questions that we didn't get to that I'll email you and we can respond to these folks. Is there anything else before we close?
No, great. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Please check out the International Project Management Day website, and you'll find a copy of the slides and the presentation, and probably by Monday or Tuesday. And I really appreciate your presentation, Erica. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
All right, you too. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
All right, bye.